On what is quickly becoming an historic day or a historic day, depending on your grammatical preference. It's great to be joined by Bill Scher, who's a contributor to the Washington Monthly, RealClearPolitics, Politico. Bill, let's not immediately include the Ukraine Russia situation in our conversation and sort of start with, like, if this weren't going on, what would your thoughts have been on where the 2022 midterms seem to be looking in terms of who's going to control the House and Senate after November, and then maybe we'll integrate the question about Russia Ukraine.
Um, well, in one respect, you would say things don't look good for Democrats. Obviously, anytime the president's party is facing a midterm, it tends to not go great. We've had 36 midterms since the Civil War, and the president's party loses House seats in 33 of those 36. Now, of course, a lot of those times they don't lose control of Congress because the margins are bigger, but now the margin is 5. So even the slightest loss, you risk losing control. And if Biden's at the same job approval in November as he is today, which is about 42%, that's not going to be a good midterm. Having said that, there are those 3 exceptions. And there's also a 4th exception where Democrats lost less than 5 seats. That was 1962. So those 4 exceptions are 1934, 1962, 1998, 2002. So what's the thread in those exceptions? 34 is FDR's first term. He's tackling the Great Depression. 62, Cuban Missile Crisis is solved 10 days before the midterm. 1998, Republicans are moving towards impeaching Bill Clinton, and there's a lot of talk in the air of constitutional crisis. And 2002, we're still in the shadow of 9/11. Crisis is the thread of those 4 exceptions. If you're in the president's party and there's a crisis and you're seen as handling that crisis well,
Right.
you can beat those odds.
Right.
Now, as it stands today, we have, again, not counting Ukraine, 2 big crises that are intertwined, the pandemic and inflation. Today, Biden is not seen as handling those well. So that's not becoming a plus. It is certainly possible that by November, the pandemic's going to look a lot better and inflation's going to look a lot better. We can't say for certain today. I mean, Omicron's definitely already winding down, and we just don't know if another new variant's going to kick up between now and then. It's going to throw us for another loop. But Ukraine is a 3rd crisis. And again, it's hardly, one cannot glibly say, oh, Biden's going to take care of this fantastically. It's a very, very complicated problem. And even the most fantastic president might not handle it in the most perfect of ways.
And to add to that, Bill, I mean, no matter what Biden does, Republicans will blame him. I mean, they're already doing it. Last night, Trump with Laura Ingraham saying the problem here is Biden and the rigged election and people coming over the U.S.-Mexico border. That he said that's the cause of what's happening in Russia, Ukraine. You have a bunch of people already saying it's his fault. And to some degree, that may stick, at least in some voters' minds.
Well, let's not completely assume that it's going to be the unanimous Republican message that Biden is a weak leader and this is all his fault. Certainly that message is out there, pushed by Trump. I'm not even going to argue that there's a better than even odds that Republicans won't do that. They very well could. But there is division in the Republican Party on a number of fronts, and certainly Ukraine is one of those issues, and policy versus Russia is one of those issues. One thing I think could help Biden and Democrats, both with Ukraine and beyond, is to play up bipartisanship. The reason why the president's party usually does poorly in midterms is you get a pendulum swing because the governing party has to govern. Governing is difficult. You have to make compromises. You can't deliver on everything that your base wants to see in the platform. Unexpected crises occur. All these things put stress on a diverse governing coalition, and the opposition can put aside their differences and just focus on how much they hate you. That's the normal order of midterm business. But we already have secured some bipartisan victories, the biggest one being the infrastructure bill. There are some smaller ones along with that. And this is done with the help of Mitch McConnell, which has made Donald Trump very mad. Donald Trump actively attacks Mitch McConnell for helping Biden.
Yeah.
And we've seen Biden give conflicting messages on this score. Sometimes he wants to say, oh, we would do a lot better if these Republicans weren't obstructing us. And sometimes he says, we're making Washington work and getting things done. And I would lean more towards that latter message than the former, because one, it shows you are getting things done. Electing us has been good for you. We've done some good things, even if things aren't perfect in the universe. And it drives wedges through the opposition. So you want to be unified yourself and divide the other guys.
Right.
And if Biden can do things with Ukraine that pull in the more hawkish anti-Putin types in the Republican Party, the Lindsey Grahams, the Marco Rubios, the Mitch McConnells, if it can make it uncomfortable for them to side with Trump, that's going to further help reverse the normal trajectory of a midterm.
I can't help but think that if the last 4 days were not what they have been with Ukraine, Russia, there would be many discussions like the ones my audience was having prior to that point. Like, for example, if Biden can only forgive some student loans between now and November, if Biden can decriminalize cannabis federally between now and November, these types of things, which it quite frankly doesn't seem Biden has any interest at all in doing. Many in my audience feel very strongly that that would have a significant impact on the outcome of the midterms. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, you got to do two things. I mean, unifying the party and splitting the opposition requires two things. You got to do something to energize your own base.
Yes.
And you got to don't take your eye off the swing. The swing still exists. Doing both those things is complicated. And there's inherent tensions there. I don't know if doing what the things you suggest, which are executive order things, which may go beyond what Biden thinks is actually constitutional or legal, and would be at minimum probably subject to litigation. That might not be in Biden's comfort zone. I do think it would be greatly helpful to get some significant piece of what was called Build Back Better passed, to let that progressive base know, hey, this wasn't a waste of your time getting us elected. We've done some things that are significance here. Right now, the progressive base is feeling that they've gotten the short end of the stick, and I understand that. And I do think you got to give them something. And so I see folks more inclined to think about what can Biden do by himself, because I don't trust Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema to do anything helpful. But whatever it is, I think it needs to be something that can get done and will stick.
Yes.
So that progressive base feels like they got something out of this.
Part of why, as you laid out, it's not looking great for Democrats in November are these historical realities that you laid out very clearly regarding the 36 midterms since the Civil War. The other part of it that I am very strongly paying attention to is that it doesn't really seem Democrats are doing anything particularly helpful to themselves in many ways. And so I'm sort of looking for help from Republicans in hurting themselves. And one of the things I'm looking at that I think is probably okay for Democrats is this sort of Civil War aspect of what's going on in the Republican Party. You've got, it used to be just pro and anti-Trump, but now you've got the never Trump, the pro-Trump, and the formerly pro-Trump, which are increasingly sort of making some noise. It seems to me, absent any great strategy from Democrats, I welcome that sort of infighting. And it sounds like you're saying in general, division on the opposite side is a good thing.
Oh, absolutely. And there's certainly things that could happen with Trump's very aggressive involvement in Republican primaries.
Right.
That's going to be hurtful to Republicans. And we can't know. It's possible Trump backs a lunatic and that lunatic wins the primary and wins the general election, which is, of course, not good. I mean, but we have examples in the very recent past where Republicans have nominated people that threw away winnable seats. Christine O'Donnell in Delaware, Todd Akin in Missouri, Richard Murdoch in Indiana. This is all pre-Trump. And Trump's now getting very involved in all sorts of races, Senate and House and governor. One of the big, difficult races for Democrats is going to be Georgia, where Raphael Warnock is holding on to a seat very tenuously. And you got Trump pushing Herschel Walker, who's got a whole litany of scandals in his past.
Yep.
And encouraging a bloody political civil war between Brian Kemp and David Perdue. And there's a book coming out called Flip by Greg Bluestein. It's not quite out yet. It hasn't been published yet, but I just wrote a book review of it. So it's on my mind. I mean, the things that Republicans did in Georgia in the run up to 2020 are just comically ridiculous and self-defeating. Democrats did a lot of things right. Republicans did a lot of things wrong. And Democrats just barely won those races. So it's very possible that Trump's going to lead Republicans down a very bad path and throw away opportunities for them.
At this point, specifically the discussions of the election was stolen. Who does that help and hurt in your calculation?
I mean, look at Georgia. That hurt Republicans in Georgia in 2020 for the runoffs.
Yeah,
we know that turnout went down in very red conservative rural areas, particularly in the place where Trump held rallies between the November election and the January runoff. So I don't know if that will replicate in 2022, but that is a risk for Republicans. That if Trump poisons the well and tells folks that things are still rigged, that can hurt them. Now, another issue with 2022 is who's going to win these Secretary of State primaries. How many Secretary of State races are these issues going to be front and center, and how does that impact turnout? Are they going to get pushed above the fold and be more prominent? Do they unify the Trumpian right and energize their base, or do they alienate those? I mean, like in Georgia, there was white, college-educated Romney-type voters that were appalled by what Trump was doing, and they moved to the Democrats. So there is that risk for Republicans there as well.
In terms of some of the factions on the left, for a while there's been, pejoratively, they're called tankies. I think a less pejorative term is the revolutionary left. Mm-hmm. And, they're kind of like Nicolas Maduro's good and cool, and Castro, Cuba, it's cool. And they were sort of like pro-Putin. But there's now this other faction that I called the alt-left. Like, for example, Glenn Greenwald and Tulsi Gabbard, they're not revolutionary left, but they certainly seem to be this alt-left thing. They were saying Putin's not going to invade, all this stuff. Are these factions, how sizable do you think these factions are in terms of the people that actually vote? And the reason I ask it that way is, in the 2020 Democratic primary, if you looked on Reddit and Twitter, you would have dramatically overestimated the level of support for someone like Bernie. But when it came to voting in the primary, that was not where the Democratic Party was at the time. So, how big do you think these factions are?
Well, I mean, I think the Bernie faction is a whole lot bigger than the Tulsi faction.
Oh, absolutely. Without a doubt.
I mean, I think Greenwald has really discredited himself amongst much of the left. Like, he's really, what he's held on to is, Tulsi left, which is a splinter. Yeah. He's mostly celebrated on the right these days than the left. So, I mean, there is this sort of horseshoe, dynamic where there are people that have this kind of mix of positions, and they're generally, anti-deep state, anti-American establishment, anti-military industrial complex establishment. They lump a lot of things into that rubric to the point where they go as far as say, as Greenwald apparently is arguing, that this isn't really an invasion, that America brought this on because, I mean, there's a Jackman article saying, well, that's a little not as complimentary to Putin as some others, but saying, well, it's not all Putin's fault because we wouldn't do the compromise where we say Ukraine can't be in NATO. And I understand there's certainly times in life where you do some strategic ambiguity to avoid conflict.
Yep.
But it's pretty clear that Ukraine has a good reason to want to be in NATO because Putin is hell bent on occupying them. They want that protection so they don't get obliterated. And so it's just hard for me to take that out of the equation when looking at the situation. So I mean, those voices are out there. They're certainly easy to hear in social media because they're loud.
Right.
But as far as their impact electorally, I think it's very small.
Yeah. And it seems the effect is more getting those people to stay home because it's sort of like in the 2016, the alt left in 2016 often seem to argue it's kind of irrelevant whether it's Trump or Hillary. And to me, it seemed less about it turned votes from Hillary to Trump than it just made some people stay home who probably would have voted for Hillary.
Yeah, and we didn't have that in 2020. I mean, people were angry enough at Trump, but that whatever their idiosyncratic foreign policy views were, or whatever their concerns about how moderate Biden would be, that became secondary to stopping Trump. I mean, you have the classic example: you put aside your differences, you unify around the common enemy. And look, dealing with Ukraine, it's not going to be necessarily easy to unite a broad swath of America around whatever policy we adopt, because it's particularly if we're doing something that is somewhat aggressive, and no one's talking about troops on the ground, of course, but even economic sanctions could get blowback where Russia does economic things to us or cyber attacks on us and creates disruption and discomfort within America. It's not a given that the average American is going to appreciate that and believe that this is worth the sacrifice that we're doing. It's going to take rhetorical effort on the part of, and this is where bipartisanship would help. As much as you and I might really think Marco Rubio is appalling or Lindsey Graham was appalling, just as a matter of politics, if Biden is saying we got to take these actions to check Putin, and it's going to mean some hurt at the pump, it's going to mean some complications with our cyber infrastructure, we're going to do our best to counter it, but you got to expect it's going to be hard sometimes. If a Rubio and a Graham and a McConnell giving Biden cover and saying he's doing the right thing, that's going to mitigate the ability for those on alt-left types who are going to, or Tucker Carlson types, are going to try to push into the media bloodstream. Why are we doing this? Biden is making you pay $5 at the pump for what? Ukraine? Why should you care about that? People on the fringes are going to push that argument, and it's an argument that can have some traction. So in that respect, they're relevant players, even if they're not necessarily electorally large. And the more diverse cover Biden has for whatever actions he takes, the better he's going to be able to withstand that and try to get the American people on his side.
Well, the next 5 days, both in terms of what happens in Ukraine, Russia, and then up to and including what Biden chooses to say at a State of the Union address, are definitely going to be worth following. We've been speaking with Bill Scher, contributor to the Washington Monthly, RealClearPolitics, Politico. Bill, always great having you on.
Great to talk to you. Take care.